All right, so our next team for the 2024-25 team previews, we have the Sacramento Kings. Trevon, the Sacramento Kings finished last year with a 46-36 record. They beat the Warriors to move on to the second part of the play-in tournament, but then they lost to the Pelicans and they did not make it to the playoffs. This was a team that the 2022-23 season, they were one of the surprises of that season. They were one of the best offenses that year, and they gained traction in a lot of people's mind of thinking that this team is poised to continue to improve going into the future. But it was kind of a disappointing season for them last year. They did pick up DeMar DeRozan this offseason. They picked up Jalen McDaniels, Devin Carter. They drafted him from Providence and they re-signed Malik Monk. One key departure was Harrison Barnes. So, Trevon, what are your thoughts on the Kings going into this season?
Yeah, so I feel like when the Kings had their season where they were top three in the Western Conference, one thing we did take away from that season going into last season was the fact that it was a very weird year in the Western Conference. I believe the teams from like 3 to 8 or 10 were only separated by a few games. So it wasn't pretty much like a dominant performance where they were really just that much head and shoulders above the rest of the Western Conference. It was kind of a lot of splitting hairs. I remember a lot of players were injured. A lot of things just were not meshing well. Some teams had some weird fits. Some teams just couldn't string anything together. And that happened for a lot of the Western Conference. It was the only team that was truly head and shoulders above the rest was probably like the Denver Nuggets. And the Kings found some level of consistency. They found a system and a play style that worked for them. Mike Brown did an amazing job coaching that young team. And pretty much coming in this season, we thought they could be something similar to how we think of the Oklahoma City Thunder, how we think of them now. But it just never really clicked that well. Even in that year when they were at the top of the West, they were a pretty lazy defensive team and they were never able really to be competitive on that end. They had fast tempo. De'Aaron Fox was going crazy in clutch time moments at the end of the game, really closing out each game. And they just never were really able to catch that same footing this season. I do think adding DeMar DeRozan adds some sort of substance to this team. This team is a very young team, or not too young because these guys do have some years under their belt, but they're not like seasoned veterans at the same time. You do have De'Aaron Fox. The year where they did finish at the top of the West, that was his first playoff appearance. And this past season, they made it to the playing game, but did not make it to the first round. So they're still fairly fresh when it comes to deep playoff basketball. And I think DeMar DeRozan does bring some of that. Obviously, his time with Toronto and it never came into full fruition with a lot of the other teams he ended up going to, but he does have that experience. And I think he brings a different style of basketball where he's not so much up and down, space the floor. He kind of gets to his spots. He's able to take advantage. He can be another guy to just simply go to. I'm very interested to see how this fits with this team just because it is such a different style. And you have a guy like Domantas Sabonis that's inside the paint. We know DeRozan is not going to do most of his damage from the perimeter as far as behind the 3-point arc, but we know how good he is in the mid range. So I'm very interested to see how that change of tempo mixes in with this Sacramento Kings squad. But I do feel like they're another one of those teams that could make it into the top six. Just how you mentioned, every team in the West can kind of be so. I think that the Kings do have that kind of experience where they've been on both ends of the ball, where they've seen the good, where they were top of the West, and where they barely missed the actual playoffs last season. So I think this year we'll see a more consistent performance on both ends of the ball. I think that they are mature enough now to understand that defense is what's going to pretty much get them to that next level. I think Mike Brown is an amazing coach, and I think that they'll have a better season compared to last season. And like I said, I'm very interested to see how DeMar fits in, just because it's such a different style of basketball that they've been playing these past 2 seasons.
Yeah, when you look at the Sacramento Kings, I think that their starting five was really, really good. They had a really good starting five, but their depth wasn't that great. They had Malik Monk coming off the bench, but outside of Malik Monk, their other bench players weren't the greatest, or they didn't produce as well as other teams' bench players. So I think that was one thing that kind of hindered them, their depth. Defensively, they actually made a pretty good jump. They weren't one of the top defensive teams. They were more middle of the pack, kind of like the Golden State Warriors in our last team preview we were talking about, where they were middle of the pack in a lot of different defensive statistics and things like that. So they made a really nice improvement on the defensive end, but offensively, they weren't the top scoring team like they were when they made the playoffs, or when they were top three in the 2022-23 season. So I think those are things that kind of evened out. And last year, it just showed how deep the West was. And it was just really close in terms of games and seeding throughout the season. And the Kings just kind of fell into the play in. So I think that they are one of those teams that could make the top six and move up from where they did, but I also think that it's a possibility they can make the play in. And it's no knock on the Sacramento Kings. That just shows how tough the Western Conference is. I'm really looking to see, can they continue to improve defensively, and how will DeMar DeRozan fit into this offense? I believe DeMar will fit well into the offense because he brings a different dynamic to this team that they just didn't have last year or the year before. And when you look at Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox, I think that they are one of the more underrated duos in the league. Domantas Sabonis had a great year last year. I think he led the league in double doubles or something like that. And De'Aaron Fox took another step forward last year. I was really impressed with his pull up jump shooting, especially from the 3-point line last season. And we all know he is a mid range assassin and is lightning quick, can get to the basket. So I'm expecting them to make a push forward. And you got Malik Monk coming off the bench. We all know he is a bucket getter coming off the bench, and he can put up points very fast. But when you look at the deficiencies on this team, I think that their depth, specifically at the center position or the front court position, they don't really have much size, I would say, or much depth at the center and power forward position. So I'm wondering how that will fare, especially in a Western Conference with a lot of teams that have really good front court play. When you look at teams like the Minnesota Timberwolves, they're a big team in the front court. You look at the Denver Nuggets, they have what most would consider the best player in the league right now, Nikola Jokic, that plays the center position. You look at Oklahoma City with Chet, and now the addition of Isaiah Hartenstein coming to the Thunder. You have Wemby to deal with. The Dallas Mavericks, they have that tandem of Lively and Gafford there. So it's just a lot of teams
You
that
did
you'll
mention
have to
Jokic,
deal
but
with.
Aaron Gordon as well.
Yeah, Aaron Gordon as well in the front court. You're definitely right with that. So you just have a lot of different teams to deal with in the West that have a big front court. And I'm wondering how the Sacramento Kings will fare with that. And that's also one of the concerns I have with the Golden State Warriors. I think the Warriors are really small in the front court. And I would have liked to see both of these teams get some help there, but this is kind of the way they like to play anyway. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's probably the most intriguing thing for me is seeing DeRozan on a team like this because I think even when you look at the Bulls, I think that was more of a fit where they weren't so much up and down pace. And DeRozan, just anytime you have a guy that operates in the mid range, it's usually gonna pretty much throw some things off because the NBA is such pace and space nowadays. So I think that seeing a different tempo will be very interesting how both sides adapt to it. And I think they will. Just seeing how if that actually is what helps them get over this kind of struggle of getting out of the first round, I'm kind of curious to see if that's like one of the missing pieces for this team for the Sacramento Kings. So very interested on that part. I still believe in De'Aaron Fox. I think he's one of the players that should be mentioned when we talk about point guards in this league. It wasn't necessarily what they would hope for as far as the team perspective and record, but I think De'Aaron Fox is still the same player that we saw in that year in the playoffs. And I think that he'll come back with the vengeance once again, just kind of being on a mission. I really do like a lot of their pieces. I like Keegan Murray a lot. I think Sabonis is a very respectable big in this league, just very solid. He's really good at what he does, and he doesn't shy away from pretty much that physical brand of basketball. We don't see too many bigs play in that kind of way. We see a lot more finesse or just role player bigs. So I think Sabonis is a big part of what the Sacramento Kings do. So I was really looking for them to have not necessarily the top 3 seed like they did in 22, just because I knew the rest of the West had such an off year, but I do see something a lot more similar to that season than we did this season. I think they'll at least be hosting a home game in the play-in, probably the 7 or 8 seed. I could see at the very least. I think that they will really be able to give themselves a chance here to make that top 6.